Before Medusa was a monster, she was a presence. Not a scream in the dark. Not a face of terror frozen in stone. But a quiet figure shaped by ritual light, temple walls, and the unspoken rules that governed both gods and mortals. Her story does not begin with serpents or curses. It begins in reverence, in silence, and in the ancient human instinct to place meaning upon beauty. In the earliest strata of Greek myth, Medusa is not immediately set apart as an aberration. She belongs to the world of the sacred, not the grotesque. In some traditions, she is counted among priestesses, her life bound to a temple and its unyielding demands. To serve the gods was not simply an honor. It was a surrender. A vow that stripped away personal desire and replaced it with duty, restraint, and visibility without agency. Temples were not shelters. They were stages. Every gesture was observed, every body symbolic. To be devoted was to be seen, and to be seen was to be vulnerable. Ancient Greek culture was deeply attuned to the power of appearance. Beauty was not neutral. It was read as favor, as danger, as a sign that the divine had touched the mortal world. To possess it was to invite attention from both gods and men, neither of whom were known for restraint. In myth, beauty rarely protects, provokes. Medusa's earliest identity exists within this tension. She is remembered not for what she did, but for what she was perceived to be. A woman marked by visibility in a world that equated visibility with availability, and devotion with obedience. Her silence is not an absence of story, but the condition under which her story unfolds. Greek myth often reflects a world where power does not need justification. The gods act, and meaning is assigned afterward. Mortals do not question intent. They endure consequence. Within this framework, Medusa's humanity is fragile, easily overwritten by divine narrative. Before she was feared, she was watched. Anthropologically, this moment matters. Myths are not born fully formed. They accumulate layers, responding to social anxieties and cultural structures. Medusa's earliest form may echo far older protective figures, apotropaic symbols used to ward off evil. Gorgon-like faces appear on shields, doorways, and temples, long before the myth crystallizes into a singular story. These images were not monsters. They were guardians, faces meant to confront danger by reflecting it back. This suggests an earlier logic, one where the terrifying was not evil, but necessary, where fear itself could be sacred. Over time, however, meaning shifts. As societies formalize power, what once protected becomes what must be controlled. The wild feminine, the uncontained force, the gaze that does not lower itself. These are no longer safeguards. They are threats. Medusa's transformation begins long before her curse. It begins when the sacred feminine loses its autonomy. In patriarchal mythic structures, female figures often serve as symbolic terrain upon which order is enforced. Their bodies become sites of moral instruction. Their stories are simplified into warnings. What they suffer is reframed as consequence, not injustice. Medusa's silence allows this transformation. Without a voice in the narrative, she becomes pliable. Her identity is shaped by those who speak after her. Psychologically, this reflects a recurring human pattern. Societies struggling with power imbalance externalize discomfort by creating figures who embody transgression. The myth does not ask what was taken from Medusa. It asks what she represents once stripped of context. Before the Gorgon, there is a woman whose presence unsettles because it cannot be fully owned. In the ritual life of ancient Greece, purity was not moral. It was spatial. To be pure was to remain within assigned boundaries. Priestesses were pure not because they were virtuous, but because they were controlled. When boundaries were crossed, willingly or not, the response was not compassion. It was correction. Myth records this correction not as cruelty, but as order restored. Yet beneath the official narrative, something persists. Discomfort. An unease that refuses to settle. Why must her story end in monstrosity? Why does beauty become justification for punishment? Why does devotion fail to protect? These questions are not asked directly, but they linger in the structure of the myth itself. Medusa's later horror only resonates because her earlier humanity is still faintly visible. The terror works because we sense the loss. The serpents horrify because they replace something that once belonged to the human world. Even the name Gorgon, derived from words associated with dread and staring, hints at perception rather than action. She is feared for what she is seen to be, not for what she does. In this way, Medusa becomes a mirror long before she becomes a weapon. The quiet tragedy of her story is not that she changes, but that the world decides what her change means. She does not speak. She is spoken about. Her silence becomes permission. And so, before the monster, there is a woman shaped by forces older than cruelty itself. Worship that demanded surrender, beauty that invited claim, and power that flowed only in one direction. Her story begins where many myths begin, in the fragile intersection between the sacred and the human, where reverence and violence are separated by nothing but interpretation. The Gorgon is not born in a moment. She is assembled slowly, piece by piece, as meaning hardens around her. And long before her gaze turned others to stone, the world had already decided not to see her at all. Medusa had a name long before it became a warning. In the ancient world, names were not labels. They were forces. To name something was to acknowledge its place within the order of things, to grant it meaning, boundary, and memory. Medusa's name, derived from roots associated with guardianship and watchfulness, did not originally belong to a monster. It belonged to a presence meant to face danger, not embody it. Before her image inspired fear, it inspired protection. Across the early Mediterranean world, long before poets shaped her into a singular figure, faces resembling the Gorgon appeared carved into stone and bronze. They watched from temple pediments, shields, thresholds, and tombs. Wide eyes, bared teeth, an unflinching stare. These were not symbols of evil. They were apotropaic images, sacred deterrents designed to repel harm by confronting it directly. To look upon such a face was to be reminded that danger could be met without retreat. Medusa, in this older symbolic layer, was not alone. She was part of a language of fear that protected rather than punished. Her gaze was not yet a curse, but a boundary. It marked the edge between the sacred and the profane, between safety and chaos. In a world without walls high enough or weapons strong enough, belief itself became armor. And Medusa's face was belief made visible. This matters, because it places her origins not in transgression, but in trust. The trust that something fierce could guard what mattered most. Temples did not display her image because they feared her. They displayed it because they believed in her power to hold the line against disorder. Over time, however, meaning shifts as societies change. As political structures harden and divine authority becomes centralized, protective forces that cannot be controlled become suspect. What once stood watch must now be explained, categorized, and ultimately subordinated. Medusa's sacred function becomes uncomfortable. Her gaze does not lower itself, does not submit. It meets the viewer directly. In patriarchal mythic systems, this is not a neutral act. To look without permission is to challenge hierarchy. To remain unsoftened is to resist interpretation. Thus, Medusa's face begins to change in the stories told about her. What was once a sacred mask becomes a literal body. What was once symbolic power becomes personal threat. The shift is subtle but decisive. Medusa is no longer an image placed by humans to protect themselves. She becomes a being who must be explained, then contained. Anthropologically, this reflects a familiar pattern. Societies often absorb older, localized symbols into newer mythologies by reworking them into cautionary figures. The sacred is not erased, it is repurposed. Reverence becomes fear. Protection becomes danger. Medusa's name survives this transition, but its meaning narrows. She is no longer the face that guards the threshold. She is the threshold itself, something to be crossed only through violence. The gaze that once defended sacred space is reframed as hostile, petrifying, unnatural. Yet even in this transformation, traces of the old reverence remain. Medusa is never weak, never insignificant. Even her enemies require divine assistance to face her. Even her death does not strip her of power. These narrative choices betray an unease. The myth knows it is dealing with something that cannot be fully diminished. Psychologically, Medusa occupies the space reserved for unresolved fear. She embodies what happens when a culture can no longer reconcile its need for protection with its need for control. The answer is not integration but inversion. The guardian becomes the threat. And still her name is spoken. Medusa. Not a title. Not a category. A singular identity preserved through centuries of retelling. This alone is telling. Many monsters blur into type. Medusa remains specific. Remembered. Fixed in form. Because she was never meant to be anonymous. Before she was cursed, before she was hunted, Medusa was sacred. Not gentle, not comforting, but necessary. A reminder that some forms of power exist not to please, but to endure. And when that kind of power becomes inconvenient, history does not destroy it, transforms it into a monster. The gods of ancient Greece were not distant abstractions. They were present, intimate, and dangerously near. Their temples rose at the heart of cities. Their myths shaped law, custom, and fear. To live beneath them was to exist under constant observation, yet without assurance of protection. The divine did not promise justice, promised power. In this world, Medusa's fate unfolds not as an anomaly, but as a pattern. The Olympian gods were not moral guides in the modern sense. They were embodiments of force, desire, and hierarchy. Their actions did not require explanation, only acceptance. Mortals did not ask why the gods acted. They asked how to survive their attention. To be seen by a god was never neutral. Greek mythology is filled with stories of divine encounters that end in transformation rather than mercy. Bodies become landscapes. Voices become echoes. Women, especially, become symbols through which divine will is expressed. What appears as chaos to the mortal eye is framed as order from above. Silence follows these encounters like a law. If Medusa served in the orbit of the divine, as priestess, guardian, or sacred presence, she existed within a structure where consent was irrelevant and appeal was impossible. The gods did not answer prayers the way humans hoped. They answered imbalance with assertion. Power corrected itself through force. This is the world that shapes her story. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy, is often remembered as just and disciplined. Yet she too is bound by the logic of Olympus. Her authority is inseparable from the system that grants it. When something sacred is violated within her domain, the response is not to confront the violation, but to restore order. Order matters more than innocence. Within Greek thought, the sanctity of a space outweighed the sanctity of a person. A temple defiled required correction, regardless of how that defilement occurred. Responsibility flowed downward. The powerful acted. The vulnerable absorbed the consequence. Medusa's humanity is irrelevant to this calculus. Anthropologically, this reflects a society structured around hierarchy rather than empathy. The gods mirror the ruling classes of the human world. Their conflicts, desires, and punishments reinforce a worldview where authority is preserved by displacement. Pain is not eliminated. It is redirected. Psychologically, this produces a particular kind of terror, not fear of punishment for wrongdoing, but fear of being chosen at all. Divine attention is unpredictable. Favor can curdle into destruction without warning. The safest position is obscurity. Medusa is denied that safety. Once seen, she cannot be unseen. Once implicated in divine narrative, she cannot return to anonymity. The gods do not undo what they have touched. They redefine it. And they do not explain themselves. The myths offer no trial, no defense, no pause for reflection. Events occur, and meaning is assigned after the fact. Mortals learn the lesson embedded in the outcome, not the intention behind it. In Medusa's case, the lesson is clear and cruel. Proximity to power is dangerous, and silence is not protection. Her name, Medusa, remains attached to this moment not because she chose it, but because she endured it. The gods pass through the story untouched. She carries its weight forward. This asymmetry is essential to understanding Greek myth. The gods are not accountable because they are not subject to the world they shape. Mortals are accountable precisely because they are. In this sense, Medusa's story is not about divine cruelty alone. It is about divine indifference. A universe where suffering does not disrupt order, and injustice does not require correction. The gods do not answer because they are not being asked. And so, the silence around Medusa is not accidental. It is structural. She stands at the intersection of sacred space and unchecked authority, where the gods do not listen and mortals cannot speak. What follows is not vengeance but administration. Not rage but procedure. The monster will come later. First, there is a world where power acts without witness, and the gods, having spoken through consequence, turn away without looking back. Greek myth rarely lingers on the moment of harm. It gestures toward it, circles it, then moves on, as though naming it too clearly would fracture the order of the story itself. What happens to Medusa is preserved not through detail, but through absence. Silence where an event should be. A rupture explained only by its aftermath. This is not coincidence. It is method. In ancient mythic tradition, violence against mortals, especially against women, is often treated as an atmospheric force rather than a moral crisis. It arrives like a storm, alters the landscape, and is then accepted as part of the world's design. The act itself matters less than the transformation it produces. And Medusa is transformed. Later sources speak of an encounter within a sacred space, an intrusion that collapses the boundary between God and mortal. Whether framed as desire or conquest, the result is the same. Something is taken, something is broken, and the story refuses to dwell there. The myths do not ask how Medusa felt. They do not ask whether she resisted or consented. Those questions belong to a moral framework the ancient world did not fully recognize. Instead, the narrative pivots immediately toward consequence. This absence is the point. Anthropologically, unnamed violence functions as a stabilizing tool. By refusing to articulate harm, a culture avoids confronting its implications. The event becomes mythic rather than human, inevitable rather than unjust. Responsibility dissolves into fate. Medusa's suffering is thus rendered unspeakable, not because it is insignificant, but because it is too destabilizing to name. Sacred spaces in Greek thought were not merely locations. They were extensions of divine authority. To violate them was to disrupt cosmic order. Yet when such a violation occurs through divine action itself, the myth faces a contradiction. How can the gods transgress their own law? The solution is displacement. The act is obscured, and its weight transferred elsewhere. Attention shifts away from the violence and toward the body that now bears its mark. Medusa's transformation becomes the story, not what necessitated it. Psychologically, this reflects a deep human discomfort with unresolvable harm. When injustice cannot be punished without threatening authority, it is reframed as transformation. Pain becomes change. Trauma becomes identity. Medusa does not remain a woman who was wronged. She becomes something else entirely. This shift is crucial. Once transformed, her original experience no longer requires acknowledgement. The monster eclipses the victim. Fear replaces empathy. The unnamed violence is sealed behind a new image powerful enough to erase what came before. And yet traces remain. The intensity of Medusa's later punishment suggests an anxiety that exceeds the crime it claims to address. The myth overcorrects. It hardens her form, sharpens her horror, ensures that no one will linger on her humanity for too long. The more monstrous she becomes, the less space there is to question how she arrived there. Silence becomes protection, not for her but for the system that produced her. Within this silence, Medusa's name persists, carrying a history the myth refuses to unpack. She becomes a vessel for unresolved tension. The story needs her to be monstrous so it does not have to be honest. Greek myth is often praised for its clarity, but here it falters. The refusal to name violence is not elegance. It is avoidance. A recognition that some truths cannot be absorbed without consequence. So the narrative moves forward, leaving the moment itself unexamined. What remains is a woman changed beyond recognition. Her body rewritten to reflect an offense she did not define. The violence that shaped her is never spoken aloud, yet it echoes through every retelling. In the fear she inspires. In the punishment she receives. In the urgency with which her humanity is erased. The unnamed act becomes the axis of her myth, precisely because it cannot be named. And in that silence, the story reveals its deepest truth. That some violences are not denied because they are rare, but because they are ordinary. Too familiar to confront. Too embedded to undo. The monster comes later. First, there is an absence where a human voice should have been. Punishment in Greek myth rarely follows guilt. Follows disruption. When order is disturbed, the world must be corrected. And correction does not ask who caused the rupture. It asks only where the rupture is most visible. In Medusa's story, the answer is clear. The mark of disorder settles not on the god who acted, but on the mortal who remains. Athena's role enters here, not as villain, but as administrator of sacred law. As goddess of wisdom, strategy, and civic order, Athena embodies control. She is not ruled by impulse like other Olympians. She preserves structure. And when her temple is defiled, the logic of Olympus demands response. Sacred space must be restored, regardless of how it was violated. Within this framework, Medusa becomes the problem to be solved. The myths frame Athena's action as punishment, but punishment implies choice. What occurs is closer to reclassification. Medusa is redefined so the world can make sense again. Her body becomes the site upon which disorder is contained. Blame in this system is not assigned through justice. It is assigned through proximity. Medusa was present. Medusa was visible. Medusa was vulnerable. That is enough. Anthropologically, this reflects a pattern common to rigid hierarchies. When authority cannot be challenged, responsibility is displaced downward. Institutions preserve themselves by converting victims into transgressors. The logic is not moral. It is functional. Athena does not confront the god who caused the rupture. She confronts the evidence left behind. This does not require cruelty. It requires loyalty to the system. The curse itself is often described with mythic economy. Hair transformed into serpents, a gaze that petrifies. Yet every element carries symbolic weight. Serpents, ancient symbols of chthonic power and renewal, are twisted into markers of horror. The gaze, once sacred and protective, becomes lethal. What Medusa once embodied is inverted. Her power is not taken away. It is weaponized against her. Psychologically, this transformation serves a dual purpose. It warns others of the cost of proximity to power, and it absolves authority of accountability. If Medusa is monstrous, then what happened to her must have been necessary. The narrative closes ranks. Athena, often celebrated as a champion of heroes, does not act out of personal malice here. She acts out of institutional necessity. This is what makes the moment unsettling. The blame does not fall because someone is cruel, but because the system demands it. Medusa's humanity cannot be accommodated without acknowledging failure at the highest level. And so, it is erased. Once transformed, Medusa no longer threatens the gods with moral complication. She becomes a symbol rather than a person. A warning rather than a memory. Her suffering is repurposed into order. And yet, the myth betrays its own discomfort. If Medusa were truly guilty, she would not need to be made so terrifying. If she were truly responsible, her punishment would not need to be absolute. The extremity of her curse suggests an anxiety deeper than justice. It suggests fear of what her story implies. That sacred spaces can be violated by those meant to rule them. That power can harm without consequence. That wisdom, when bound to hierarchy, can become cruelty disguised as necessity. Medusa carries this contradiction in her form. Every serpent, every frozen victim, is a reminder that blame has weight. And that when blame is misdirected, it does not vanish. It accumulates. By the time Athena is done, order has been restored. The temple is pure again. The gods are unchallenged. Only Medusa has changed. She stands transformed not because she was monstrous, but because the world needed a monster. A figure to absorb shame that could not be spoken aloud. A body to bear the cost of divine infallibility. When blame becomes divine, it no longer seeks truth. Seeks silence. Monsters are not born in a moment. They are assembled. Medusa's transformation does not erupt from chaos or rage, but from design. Every alteration to her body carries intention, not cruelty alone but instruction. The curse does not destroy her power. It reshapes it into something the world can fear without questioning. Serpents replace her hair, living symbols of what must not be touched. In ancient belief, snakes were creatures of the threshold, moving between earth and underworld, life and decay. To crown Medusa with them is to exile her from the human world while tethering her to something older and darker. She becomes liminal, neither fully alive nor fully dead. Her gaze is the final transformation. Once, to look upon Medusa may have been to encounter the sacred. Now to meet her eyes is to lose motion, warmth, time. Stone is not merely death. It is permanence. Her victims are not destroyed, but arrested. Frozen in the act of seeing her. The myth teaches that to look directly at what has been wronged is unbearable. This is the birth of the monster, but also the completion of a narrative necessity. Medusa must become terrifying so that no one lingers too long on how she came to be this way. Fear replaces memory. Horror silences curiosity. Anthropologically, monsters often emerge where societies struggle to integrate contradiction. Medusa embodies too many unresolved truths: violated sanctity, unaccountable power, punished innocence. The only way to stabilize these tensions is to externalize them into a figure that can be opposed. The monster gives fear a shape. Once Medusa is transformed, the moral axis of the story shifts. She is no longer something that happened to someone. She is something that happens to others. Her existence justifies future violence against her. The world can now act without guilt. Psychologically, this shift is crucial. When a victim becomes a threat, empathy becomes dangerous. Compassion is replaced by self-defense. The narrative frees itself from responsibility. And yet, the monster is never made small. Medusa's power is immense. She does not chase. She does not hunt. She simply exists, and that is enough. Men travel great distances to find her, armed with gifts from gods, yet still fear to face her directly. They rely on reflections, shields, and distance. Even as a monster, Medusa commands respect. This contradiction reveals the myth's unresolved core. If she were truly nothing more than a beast, she would not require such care to destroy. Her danger is not physical alone. It is symbolic. To face her directly would mean confronting what she represents. So the story ensures that no one does. Her isolation completes the process. Exiled to the edges of the known world, Medusa is removed from society, history, and context. Monsters must live far away, where their origins cannot be examined. Distance turns tragedy into legend. By the time she is fully formed in the myth, Medusa no longer resembles the woman she once was. This is the point. The transformation must be total for the narrative to hold. Yet something human persists in the structure of her curse. She does not attack indiscriminately. Her power is reactive. It activates only when she is seen. The danger lies not in her pursuit, but in the gaze directed at her. Those who look are the ones who suffer. This detail matters. It suggests that Medusa's monstrosity is not aggression, but refusal. A refusal to be observed without consequence. A boundary enforced absolutely. In this way, the monster is not born from violence alone, but from the need to control how violence is remembered. Medusa becomes terrifying so that the story can move forward without looking back. The birth of the monster is the burial of the woman. And buried things in myth never stay silent forever. Fear is never merely an emotion. In myth it is a system. By the time Medusa is fully transformed, her purpose within the story has crystallized. She is no longer a consequence of divine action, but a mechanism through which society explains itself. Her existence reorganizes the moral landscape. She teaches where power lies, who may look, and who must turn away. The Gorgon does not rule through armies or decrees. She rules through anticipation. In ancient societies, fear was one of the most reliable tools of cohesion. Laws could be broken. Customs could be questioned. But fear, when properly shaped, required no enforcement. It lived inside the body, tightening muscles, guiding behavior long before reason intervened. Myth gave fear a face so it could be remembered. Medusa's face becomes that instrument. Her gaze does not hunt down the innocent. Punishes proximity. Those who approach her do so knowing the risk. In this way, the myth reframes danger as choice. If you are turned to stone, it is because you looked. Responsibility is subtly transferred from the system to the individual. This is how fear becomes order. Anthropologically, monsters often function as boundary markers. They guard the edges of acceptable behavior, warning against transgression without the need for constant surveillance. Medusa occupies this role perfectly. She stands at the intersection of taboo and punishment. Her presence discourages curiosity, discourages intrusion, discourages looking too closely. What she protects is not merely territory, but hierarchy. The myth teaches that some sights are forbidden. Some truths are lethal. To look directly is to risk annihilation. Reflection is safer than confrontation. Distance is wisdom. These lessons are not accidental. Psychologically, Medusa embodies the consequences of seeing what one is not meant to see. In a culture where authority depends on unquestioned narratives, direct perception is dangerous. The Gorgon's curse externalizes this danger. She becomes the reason why certain questions are never asked. Why did this happen? Who is responsible? What was taken? The myth answers by making inquiry itself fatal. Medusa's power enforces obedience without speech. She does not persuade. She does not explain. She simply exists, and that existence reshapes behavior around her. Heroes plan carefully. Gods intervene indirectly. Ordinary people stay away entirely. Fear produces compliance where logic might fail. Importantly, Medusa's fear is not chaotic. It is precise. Her curse activates only through the gaze. This specificity mirrors social control mechanisms that punish not action, but awareness. Knowing too much, seeing too clearly, refusing to avert one's eyes. These become the true transgressions. The myth does not condemn violence alone. It condemns witnessing. In this way, Medusa becomes a living rule. A reminder that survival depends on knowing when not to look. Her presence polices the boundary between ignorance and understanding. Yet fear, once institutionalized, always requires renewal. Stories of Medusa are retold not simply to frighten, but to reinforce memory. Each retelling sharpens her image, stripping away nuance, amplifying terror. Over time, the monster eclipses the message that created her. Fear becomes self-sustaining. And still, the myth betrays its unease. If Medusa were truly nothing more than an embodiment of danger, she would not need to be isolated. But she is placed at the edge of the world, far from cities and temples. Fear must be controlled as much as it controls. Too close, and it invites reflection. Too distant, and it fades. So she is kept just far enough away to remain legend. Within this structure, Medusa's humanity is irrelevant. Her pain is unnecessary to explain. What matters is function. She teaches restraint. He teaches obedience. She teaches the cost of disobedient sight. Fear becomes moral instruction. But fear is a fragile foundation. It suppresses questions rather than resolving them. And what is suppressed does not disappear. Hardens. Wait. Medusa stands as proof of this tension. A figure meant to enforce order, yet born from disorder never addressed. The more she terrifies, the more she hints at what lies beneath the myth. Because fear can command silence, but it cannot command forgetting. Exile is not simply removal. It is erasure made geographic. When Medusa is driven to the farthest reaches of the known world, the myth performs its final act of containment. Distance becomes a form of forgetting. By placing her beyond familiar lands, the story ensures that her origins cannot be questioned, only her danger remembered. The ancient world imagined its edges as spaces of distortion. Beyond the borders of the polis lay regions where natural law bent, where creatures were larger, stranger, and less human. To send Medusa there is to declare her no longer part of shared reality. She is relocated from history into legend. This is not mercy. It is strategy. Anthropologically, exile has long been used to manage figures that destabilize social order. Those who cannot be punished without provoking discomfort are instead removed. Their absence restores calm, while their memory is reshaped into warning. Medusa's exile follows this logic precisely. She is no longer a woman who suffered injustice. She is a threat that exists somewhere else. By placing her at the world's edge, the myth frees society from proximity to its own failure. Cities remain pure. Temples remain intact. The gods remain unchallenged. All that is troubling is pushed outward, into a space that can be safely imagined but never visited. Yet exile does not eliminate power. Concentrates it. Alone, Medusa becomes absolute. With no community to dilute her meaning, she is reduced to a single function. She exists only as the Gorgon. Isolation sharpens her mythic outline, stripping away ambiguity. This makes her easier to fear, but also harder to understand. Psychologically, exile transforms pain into identity. When a figure is cut off from social recognition, their suffering loses context and becomes essence. Medusa is no longer someone to whom something happened. She becomes what happened. The world's edge is where complexity goes to die. And yet, the myth cannot entirely sever her from the center. Heroes still travel to her. Gods still speak of her. Her head will eventually return, carried back into civilization as a weapon. Exile is never complete. What is removed always finds a way back, altered but intact. This contradiction reveals the myth's anxiety. If Medusa truly belonged outside the world, she would not remain necessary to it. But she does. Her image continues to guard temples. Her power continues to serve gods and heroes. Even in exile she is useful. She is feared from afar and exploited from close. The geography of her banishment mirrors a psychological boundary. Medusa occupies the space reserved for things society refuses to integrate but cannot destroy. She is too potent to erase, too unsettling to include. So she is kept distant, invoked only when needed. In ancient storytelling, the edge of the world is not empty. It is crowded with meaning. Monsters, spirits, and forgotten gods gather there, holding what the center cannot bear. Medusa joins them not because she is unnatural, but because she remembers too much. Exile ensures that her memory remains abstract. From afar, it is easier to believe she was always a monster. Distance smooths contradiction. The farther she is from the human world, the less human she becomes. And yet, exile also preserves her. At the edge, Medusa is untouched by time. Cities fall. Empires fade. But she remains fixed, waiting. Her story does not evolve because it is no longer lived. It is frozen, like her victims, in a single moment of meaning. This is the cost of exile. It protects society from reflection, but it also traps the exiled in eternal repetition. Medusa cannot move beyond her role. She cannot change. She can only be encountered, feared, and destroyed. The world believes it has placed her safely beyond its borders. But the edge of the world is never as far away as it seems. It is only the place where truths are stored until someone is brave, or careless, enough to go looking. Heroes in Greek myth rarely arrive alone. They come escorted by prophecy, armed by gods, and absolved in advance. Perseus enters Medusa's story not as a wanderer, but as a solution. His journey is framed as necessity, his violence as destiny. From the moment his path is set, the outcome is never in doubt. This is not a hunt born of fear or survival. It is an execution planned from afar. The gods do not ask Perseus to understand Medusa. They ask him to end her. Divine gifts prepare him for the task. A mirrored shield so he will not have to look directly. Winged sandals to keep him untouched by the ground she occupies. A curved blade, clean and precise, designed for a single strike. Even invisibility is granted, ensuring distance at every stage. The hero is protected not from danger, but from encounter. This detail matters. Perseus does not face Medusa as a being. He faces her as a problem to be solved through technique. Reflection replaces recognition. Strategy replaces confrontation. The myth is careful to ensure that he never meets her gaze, never sees her as she sees him. To look directly would complicate the story. Anthropologically, heroes often function as instruments of cultural will. They enact what society desires but does not wish to acknowledge as its own doing. Perseus carries out a violence that has already been justified. His heroism lies not in moral courage, but in obedience to narrative. He does not question why Medusa must die. He accepts that she must. Psychologically, Perseus represents the comfort of clean solutions. He is the fantasy that injustice can be resolved without mess, that wrongs can be corrected without intimacy. His tools create separation at every level. He kills without touching. He triumphs without seeing. The blade falls while Medusa sleeps. This moment is often portrayed as mercy, but sleep here is not kindness. It is vulnerability unguarded. The myth ensures she does not resist, does not speak, does not interrupt the act with humanity. Her death must be swift to preserve the hero's clarity. Medusa is denied even the dignity of witness. From her body spring new life, Pegasus and Chrysaor, a final contradiction the myth cannot suppress. Creation follows destruction, as though the story itself acknowledges that something more than monstrosity has been ended. Yet even this miracle is redirected away from her. The children belong to the god, not the mother. Perseus takes her head. Decapitation is not only killing, it is silencing. The voice, the gaze, the identity, all are contained in the face. By severing it, the myth ensures Medusa can never speak again. What remains is power without context, terror without memory. And still, the hero does not discard it. He carries the head with care, using it as a weapon against others. Enemies are turned to stone, obstacles erased. Medusa's power, once feared, now serves the same divine order that destroyed her. Her gaze is acceptable when controlled. This is the final purification of violence. The hero's blade is called clean because it leaves no stain on him. Responsibility flows upward, consequence downward. Perseus is celebrated, rewarded, remembered. Medusa is reduced to an artifact. Yet the myth betrays an unease it cannot fully bury. If Medusa were truly only a monster, her power would die with her. But it does not. It endures, feared even in death. Athena herself places the head upon her shield, a reminder that what was destroyed is still necessary. Perseus completes his task and moves on. Medusa remains. Her story ends not with understanding but with utility. The hero passes into legend as a symbol of triumph. The monster becomes a tool of order. And somewhere beneath the polished blade and divine gifts, a quieter truth lingers, that the cleanest violence is often the one that refuses to look at what it has done. Medusa's death is swift, ceremonial, and strangely public, though no one truly witnesses it. In myth, there is no lamentation, no ritual of grief, no echo of loss. Only the necessary act, precise and absolute, unfolding within the cold arithmetic of divine and heroic logic. The story moves quickly past her, as though the moment itself must vanish, leaving only consequence in its wake. She dies not as a woman, but as a problem resolved. Her body, once vibrant and sacred, is reduced to the physical evidence of narrative necessity. The serpents in her hair do not coil in rage. They coil in stillness, markers of a violence both inflicted and inherited. The gaze that once held the sacred, the eyes that once symbolized protection and power, are silenced forever. Stone replaces breath. Immobility replaces motion. What had been alive, observed, and human becomes an emblem of caution. The absence of mourning is deliberate. In Greek myth, the public acknowledgement of grief implies social or moral responsibility. To lament Medusa would be to admit a wrong, to recognize injustice. But in her story, wrong is inseparable from order. Athena's logic, the hero's triumph, the narrative's direction, all demand erasure. Mourning would challenge the clarity of consequence. It would threaten the very lesson the myth intends to impart, that some transgressions must be corrected, regardless of innocence, and that fear must remain uncompromised. Anthropologically, this is a familiar pattern. Societies often cope with systemic injustice not by confronting it, but by institutionalizing its effects. Medusa's death without grief transforms human suffering into abstract principle. Her story becomes legible only as warning and power, stripped of the messy, inconvenient truths of experience. She is a monument, but one erected by omission. Even in death, Medusa is not powerless. Her head retains the lethal potency of her gaze, now portable, now a weapon wielded by Perseus and later by Athena herself. Life departs from her body, yet essence endures. Her terror is codified, repurposed, rendered safe for society to manipulate. This is the paradox of her story. Ultimate destruction coincides with ultimate preservation. The monster cannot die because she is no longer just a being. She is a function. Psychologically, this creates a layered tension. The myth denies Medusa mourning, but it does not deny her significance. The horror of her death is compounded by its cleanliness. There is no witness to her suffering beyond those who imagine it. No human voice testifies to what was taken from her, only the echo of the narrative itself. She becomes a lesson in absence, a ghost framed in stone and mythic logic. The story teaches a quiet, chilling principle. Power that is inconvenient is not erased by violence alone. It is contained, reframed, and abstracted. Medusa's death exemplifies this. She is removed from the living world, but she cannot be removed from memory or from function. Her eradication is precise, yet incomplete. And so, when the blade falls and her life ends, the myth does not pause to mark the human cost. There is no lament, no echo, no mourning song. Only the clean arc of consequence, the shadow of fear, and the beginning of legend. Her death is absolute in action, yet infinite in effect. And in that silence, in the absence of grief, the story whispers the oldest truth of all. Some lives are sacrificed not for justice, but for the comfort of those who wield power, and monsters are often born from the ones who survive the narrative unscathed. Death, in Medusa's story, is not an end. It is transformation. Her body falls, her life extinguished, yet her essence persists, compressed, sharpened, and redirected. The very act meant to erase her only ensures that her power continues, now confined to a new, horrifying form. From the severed head springs both terror and utility, a weapon to be wielded by heroes and gods alike. Even in decapitation, Medusa's gaze retains its potency. Stone does not merely kill. It memorializes. Every turned figure is a testament to her enduring force. The hero's triumph is hollow without this residue of threat, a lingering presence that cannot be fully tamed. In this way, her power is paradoxically both contained and immortalized. Death did not silence her. It made her precise, absolute, and terrifyingly portable. Anthropologically, this echoes a common motif. that what is suppressed or punished often survives in altered form. Societies attempt to neutralize threats by isolating them, by codifying their danger, by transforming lived experience into object lesson. Medusa becomes exactly that. A distilled warning, an artifact of fear, stripped of her complexity but amplified in consequence. The violence she endured is reinterpreted as menace, and in that translation, her legacy persists. Her continued potency also reveals the anxious logic of myth. Power, once recognized, cannot simply be destroyed without destabilizing the hierarchy it threatens. To kill Medusa without preserving her force would be to risk acknowledging the injustice behind her punishment. By retaining her gaze, the myth ensures that society benefits from the very power it once sought to condemn. Her death is a transaction, life removed, potency captured. Psychologically, this renders Medusa a symbol both fearsome and inescapable. She embodies the tension between vulnerability and authority. Those who harm her believe they erase her, but her presence lingers in every mythic retelling, in every shield upon which her head is mounted, in every stone-cold figure of terror. Her story teaches that even violence carried out in the name of order cannot eliminate what it does not understand. This persistence is central to her mythic resonance. Perseus carries her head, not as a corpse, but as a tool, a weapon that turns enemies into stone. Athena mounts it upon her aegis, a reminder that even divine judgment depends upon containment rather than eradication. The monster lives, yet the human beneath her is forever obscured. The tragedy is not only what she suffered, but what the story allows her to retain. Power without agency, effect without recognition. Even as the world attempts to normalize her, Medusa refuses erasure. She haunts thresholds, temple walls, and stories. Her gaze enforces law and legend alike. Those who confront her do so at a distance, mediated through reflection, prophecy, or mythic caution. Her survival ensures that she is never fully appropriated, never fully owned, never entirely understood. In this way, decapitation is not an end, but a paradox. Death both limits and magnifies. The very act meant to neutralize her transforms Medusa into a form of enduring authority, a ghostly enforcer of rules that were never hers to make. Her presence persists as proof. Some power once recognized cannot be confined by death. And so, Medusa's story teaches that mortality may claim the body, but it cannot claim the force it contained. The woman who suffered, violated, and punished is eclipsed by the weapon she becomes. Power survives where life has ended. And in that survival, the world learns to fear her, long after she can no longer speak. Medusa's story does not end with her death, nor with the hero's triumph. It continues in the gaze of those who remember, in the carved shields and temple pediments, in the whispered warnings passed from parent to child. She becomes less a figure than a function, a signpost marking the boundary between obedience and curiosity, safety and ruin. The Gorgon lives in story because the lesson she embodies cannot be ignored. Her terror is moral as much as it is physical. To look upon Medusa is to confront transgression, to face what one is not meant to see. Heroes are instructed, mortals warned, societies instructed by her existence. She is a mirror, reflecting both human fear and the consequences of violating divine or social order. The myth ensures that even when she is absent, her presence lingers, guiding behavior and codifying caution. Anthropologically, this reflects a pattern repeated across cultures. Monsters enforce the rules of the world when law and morality are insufficient. Medusa occupies the intersection of divine retribution and social instruction. Her power enforces boundaries without requiring debate, her gaze serving as a silent but absolute deterrent. She is a warning made flesh or stone. Yet beneath the veneer of instruction lies a darker resonance. The warnings she inspires obscure the truth of her origin. Violence done to her is reframed as threat. Punishment inflicted upon innocence becomes an emblem of justice. Children are taught to fear what they do not understand, and the memory of violation is inverted into the memory of danger. In this way, Medusa's story functions as both caution and concealment. Psychologically, the Gorgon embodies the displacement of guilt and anxiety. By externalizing fear into her image, society avoids confronting its own complicity. The divine cruelty, the misuse of power, the inequities baked into myth and ritual. Medusa becomes a container for collective unease. Her story simplified into horror so that the uncomfortable truths surrounding it may be ignored. She is feared because she is dangerous, yes, but also because she represents what those in power wish to hide. Her image endures because fear is a tool more enduring than memory. Sculpted heads, apotropaic masks, and the echoed caution in storytelling ensure that her gaze continues to shape behavior. Medusa teaches that transgression carries consequences, that power must be respected, and that some boundaries cannot be crossed without harm. Her presence in myth is functional, absolute, and necessary. And yet, even as a warning, she carries traces of the woman she once was. Beneath the serpents, beneath the stone gaze, there is a history of devotion, of sacred duty, of injustice endured. It is subtle, hidden beneath layers of fear, but it remains. Her story is not only about horror. It is about the persistence of memory through distortion. In this, Medusa remains profoundly human. She warns not only of the external consequences of disobedience, but of the internal danger of erasing empathy. Her myth teaches that fear can instruct, but it can also obscure, that power can protect, but it can also punish. And that sometimes the figure we are warned to avoid is the very one who suffered most. The Gorgon lives as a sentinel at the edges of understanding. Her head turned toward the world she once inhabited, her presence a caution, a reflection, a mirror of both divine wrath and human complicity. And so, the warning endures, whispered in shadow, remembered in terror, and carved forever into the edges of imagination. Medusa becomes legend, not merely for what she does, but for what she represents. The cost of power misapplied, and the fragility of humanity in a world ruled by gods. Medusa endures, not because she is monstrous, but because the world needed her to be. Her story, refracted through centuries, reveals more about human societies than it ever does about the woman beneath the serpents. She is a mirror, a lesson, a warning, and above all, a vessel for truths too unsettling to face directly. In her, fear and fascination intertwine, shaping the moral and social imagination of every culture that retells her tale. From sacred priestess to petrifying Gorgon, Medusa's journey charts the passage of power through human perception. What was once worshipped becomes feared. What was once protected becomes persecuted. Her face, her gaze, her body, all are transformed into instruments of cultural instruction. The myths do not merely recount her life. They manipulate it, calibrating horror to ensure obedience, shaping memory to conceal injustice, and codifying terror into symbols that outlast history itself. Anthropologically, Medusa illustrates the inevitability of narrative survival over human justice. Her punishment, her exile, and her death all serve to stabilize authority. Divine, heroic, and societal. Yet in doing so, the story preserves her potency. She cannot be destroyed because her power is not merely physical. It is psychological, symbolic, eternal. The Gorgon survives decapitation, exile, and distortion because the world cannot absorb the contradictions she embodies. Innocence violated, power misapplied, and suffering misdirected. Psychologically, her endurance reflects an uncomfortable human truth. Societies often need monsters to hold their collective anxieties at bay. Medusa becomes the repository of what is inconvenient, terrifying, or shameful. Her body carries the memory of wrongs that cannot be confronted openly. Her gaze petrifies because the world that punished her feared the questions she might raise. The monster exists to enforce lessons that the living dare not articulate. Yet even as she is feared and controlled, Medusa remains profoundly alive within the mythic imagination. She continues to inspire awe, reflection, and even empathy. Artists, writers, and scholars have long sensed that the Gorgon is more than a cautionary figure. She is a survivor of the violence and indifference that shaped her. In every retelling, her story challenges us to see beyond the mask of monstrosity, to acknowledge the human suffering hidden beneath the spectacle. In this sense, Medusa's myth endures because it resonates with what we continue to wrestle with: power, vulnerability, injustice, and the way societies preserve themselves at the expense of the innocent. She reminds us that monsters are rarely born fully formed. They are made, piece, by fear, by hierarchy, and by the silences we construct around transgression. The figure we call monstrous is often the wounded, the displaced, the misunderstood, the very person whose story we refuse to hear. By the time her head becomes a weapon, by the time her gaze petrifies generations of mythic characters, Medusa has already transcended her narrative function. She embodies the consequences of misapplied power, the dangers of unaccountable authority, and the haunting persistence of injustice. She exists at the boundary between human memory and collective fear, a threshold guardian of both lesson and warning. And so, the story comes full circle. The woman who was once sacred, who suffered without recourse, who was transformed against her will, has become a symbol as enduring as the myths themselves. The world needed her to be monstrous, because it needed a reflection of its own failings, a sentinel against the uncomfortable truths of violence, vulnerability, and divine indifference. Medusa endures because she is necessary. She is not simply a monster. She is memory, warning, and power, a figure whose gaze turns not only stone but conscience. And in that gaze, we are reminded that the monsters we fear most are often the ones we made ourselves, out of fear, silence, and the failure to reckon with injustice.